So there's the exposure triangle. These three elements, we have the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. These three elements come together for you to properly expose your image. Let me just take you quickly into what an aperture is, how to know what aperture to use for when, what situation, why situation, and let's just master aperture. Let's get straight into the video. So the aperture is actually a property of the lens. So depending on the type of lens that you have, you can get a different range of aperture. For instance, I'm shooting with a Tamron 28 to 75 millimeter 2.8. All right, so with this particular lens, I can have an aperture of say 2.8 upwards. All right, I can have 2.8 all the way to f22. If I had a different lens on, maybe I would have an aperture, say, like the way I record this video like this, I have an aperture of 1.8 upwards. And I've used others where I have from f4, sometimes some of them have f3. So depending on the lens that you are using, you know the aperture that you can use. You can know the aperture range of any lens just by looking straight on the particular lens. Usually they write it there. You see f/ and then they put something there. All the aperture does is that it's just controlling the amount of light that enters into your camera. On the lens, there is this part where the light comes in, all right? And there's also the part that's attached to the camera. It has a small hole in there. If you look into your camera, you can almost see them, all right? There's a small hole in there, right there that you can see. That is the aperture, and that's what the aperture controls. So the bigger the hole, the more light that comes in, and the smaller the hole, the less light that comes in. So that is why it can help you control the exposure or how bright or dark your subject looks like. But there's a little twist when it comes to the aperture. You know why? If you have a lower f-stop, say f1, f2, f2.8, those lower numbers, right, means you're going to have a bigger hole for the aperture. And what that also means is that more light can hit your sensor, right? And what that also means is that you get a lot of background blur or bokeh, which people really do love when it comes to photography. Now, when I started out, I had a little problem with that. I'm like, why will I shoot at a higher aperture then if I just want to get all of that background blur in focus? And there's a little problem here. One thing about using a very low aperture is that it also means you have a shallow depth of field. That is why you can get so much background blur. A shallow depth of field means that very little in focus. Why do you need this as a photographer? As a photographer, you want to make sure you're capturing the moment, all right? So if you're capturing just a single person, then using a low aperture makes sense. But then if you're capturing a group, you don't need a low aperture. Otherwise, most of your pictures will be out of focus. All right. So the trick I use is that I look at how many people I am shooting. If I'm shooting, say, 1 or 2 people, then I'm going to use, if I'm shooting 1 person, 1.8 or the lowest possible aperture. If I'm shooting 2 people, then I'm going to use, say, 2.8. But if I'm shooting like, say, 4 or 5 for a group, then F4 should do, or F8 or F6, whatever stop I do. Right, so the more the number, the bigger the aperture. That is my trick. The more the number, the bigger the aperture. The more the number, the bigger the aperture. But you know, the bigger the aperture too, the darker the image becomes, and then the less the background blur becomes. So you have to make it up with your ISO and your shutter speed to compensate for that brightness. Aperture is one of the first things that you might have to look at when you're setting up your camera to take a picture. Because if you look at the scene, and you know who you want to have in focus or what you want to have in focus, you quickly get to that and then you set your aperture. You quickly look at your shutter speed, compensate that too, and then you look at ISO to compensate that. But the moment you get to a very dark room, you might come from the other way round. That is a little bit about aperture. If you have less people, use a lower number. So 1 person, you can use 1.4, 1.8. As the number gets higher and higher, you want to, the number of people get higher and higher, you increase the number, the aperture number to match it as well. Just know what happens the moment you are increasing the aperture number. Because the lower the number, it means more light gets to hit the sensor and then means a very brighter image. The higher the number, you know that less light hits the sensor and a little more darker image. So you have to adjust your other settings to meet it. You don't really need to start shooting in manual if you're not so comfortable with the exposure triangle. I made a video right here where I talk about shooting in aperture priority. What I was shooting in before I switched fully to manual. I still go back as and when it's needed, but usually I'm shooting in manual. It's a very good one for you. So check that video out.